The relentless Arizona sun blazed overhead like a forge left burning too long, turning the desert landscape into a shimmering furnace of heat and desperation. Jake Brennan wiped the sweat from his brow with a bandana that had long since stopped being white, squinting through the waves of heat that rose from the baked earth like ghostly dancers. His horse, a sturdy bay mare named Belle, moved with the careful, measured steps of an animal that knew water was scarce and every ounce of energy precious. Jake's small ranch lay 3 days behind him, nestled in a valley that had once been green with promise but now bore the scars of the worst drought in living memory. For 6 months, the sky had remained a pitiless blue dome, offering nothing but heat and broken dreams. His cattle were dying, his crops had withered to dust, and his well had run dry 2 weeks ago. The trip to Tucson had been his last hope, borrowing money against next year's harvest that might never come. The banker's words still echoed in his mind like a death knell. "Sorry, Jake. Can't loan money on dead cattle and dust. You've got until the end of the month to make your payment, or the ranch goes up for auction." Now, with barely enough water left in his canteen to last the journey home, Jake faced the harsh mathematics of survival. Every sip he took brought him closer to his ranch, but also closer to the moment when the metal container would ring hollow against his palm. Belle needed water too, and a man who let his horse die in the desert was as good as dead himself. The landscape around them told the story of the drought's cruelty. Normally, green mesquite bushes stood like brown skeletons, their branches reaching toward the merciless sky in silent supplication. The arroyos that should have carried seasonal streams were nothing but channels of cracked mud and sun-bleached stones. Even the hardy barrel cacti showed signs of stress, their normally plump surfaces beginning to wrinkle and shrink. Jake took another careful sip from his canteen, feeling the lukewarm water slide down his parched throat. By his calculation, he had perhaps a day's worth left if he was careful. Belle snorted and tossed her head, her ears swiveling forward as she caught something his human senses had missed. Then Jake heard it too, a sound that shouldn't exist in this waterless wasteland. Someone was crying. Following the sound, Jake guided Belle around a cluster of towering saguaro cacti and down into a small depression where ancient floods had carved a natural shelter from the rocks. There, huddled in the meager shade of an overhanging boulder, sat a young Apache boy who couldn't have been more than 10 years old. The child was in desperate condition. His traditional buckskin clothes were torn and stained with blood from numerous cuts and scrapes, suggesting he'd been traveling rough country for some time. His long black hair was matted with dust and sweat, and his small face was burned red by the merciless Sunday. But it was his eyes that struck Jake, the hardest, dark, intelligent eyes that held the hollow, desperate look of someone who had given up hope. Jake dismounted slowly, keeping his movements calm and non-threatening. Relations between the Apache and white settlers in this territory were complicated at best, often erupting into violence that left families on both sides grieving. But this was just a child, alone and suffering in the vast emptiness of the desert. "Easy there, son," Jake said softly, though he wasn't sure if the boy spoke English. "I'm not going to hurt you." The boy looked up at him with a mixture of fear and exhaustion, his small chest rising and falling rapidly with each shallow breath. When he tried to speak, only a dry croak emerged from his parched throat. His lips were cracked and bleeding, his tongue swollen from dehydration. Jake knelt down carefully, pulling his canteen from his belt. The metal was warm from the heat, and when he shook it gently, the liquid inside sloshed with a sound that seemed precious beyond measure. This was his water, his lifeline home. The difference between making it back to his ranch and becoming another set of bones, bleaching in the Arizona Sunday. The boy's eyes fixed on the canteen with the intensity of a man staring at salvation. Jake could see the child's hands trembling, whether from weakness or desperate hope, he couldn't tell. In that moment, Jake faced a choice that would define not just the next few hours, but the rest of his life. He could give the boy a sip, just enough to ease his suffering a little, and hope they both somehow found more water before it was too late. Or he could keep his precious water and continue on, leaving the child to whatever fate awaited him in this merciless landscape. But as Jake looked into those desperate young eyes, he realized there was really no choice at all. Jake unscrewed the cap of his canteen with hands that were steadier than he felt inside. The boy watched every movement with the focused intensity of a hawk, his breathing becoming even more labored as hope and desperation warred in his expression. "Here you go, son," Jake said gently, offering the canteen. "Drink slow now. Too much too fast will make you sick." The boy's eyes widened in disbelief, as if he couldn't quite comprehend that a white man was offering him water. Tentatively, he reached out, with shaking hands, and took the canteen. When he tilted it to his lips and felt the first drops of lukewarm water touch his tongue, tears began streaming down his dust-caked cheeks. Jake watched as the child took small, careful sips, fighting every instinct that screamed at him to snatch the canteen back. Each swallow the boy took was water Jake would never get back, water he needed for his own survival and Belle's. But seeing the life gradually return to the child's eyes made it impossible to regret his decision. After several minutes, the boy reluctantly handed the canteen back. Though Jake could see he was still desperately thirsty, the level of water inside had dropped by nearly half. "Keep it," Jake said, pushing the canteen back toward the boy. "You need it more than I do." The child stared at him in shock, then began speaking rapidly in Apache, his voice stronger now but still rough from dehydration. Though Jake couldn't understand the words, the tone was unmistakably one of gratitude and disbelief. "What's your name, son?" Jake asked, settling down in the shade beside the boy. "I'm Jake." The child looked at him for a long moment, then pointed to himself. "Key," he said carefully. "My name?" "Key. Well, Key, looks like we're both in a fix out here." Jake gestured to the empty landscape around them. "How long you been wandering?" Key held up 3 fingers, then 4, uncertainty clouding his features. 3 or 4 days alone in the desert, without water. It was a miracle. The boy was still alive. "My horse," Key said slowly, the English words coming with obvious effort. "Snake bite. Horse die. I walk. Look for water. No find." Jake nodded grimly. A boy alone on foot in this country, even an Apache boy raised to survive in harsh conditions, faced nearly impossible odds. Without water, Key would have been dead within another day, maybe 2 at most. The irony wasn't lost on Jake. Here he was, a rancher facing ruin, sharing his last precious water with an Apache child while his own future crumbled like dust in the wind. But somehow, seeing the gratitude in Key's eyes, Jake felt something he hadn't experienced in months, a sense that he'd done something truly important. As the afternoon heat reached its brutal peak, Jake made a shelter using his saddle blanket stretched between 2 rocks, creating a small pocket of shade big enough for both of them and Belle. Key had gained strength from the water, and his English, while limited, was good enough for basic communication. "My people," Key said, pointing toward the distant mountains that shimmered like mirages in the heat. "They look for me, but—" He gestured helplessly at the vast expanse of desert. "Hard to find." Jake studied the boy's face, noting the intelligence there despite his youth. "How'd you get separated from them in the first place?" Key's expression darkened. "Bad white men. They come to our camp, steal horses. I follow. Try to get horses back." His small hands clenched into fists. "They see me, chase me. I run into desert to hide. Get lost." The story painted a picture Jake had heard too many times: horse thieves preying on Apache camps, stealing their most prized possessions and leaving families stranded in hostile territory. It was a practice that enraged both honest ranchers and the Apache themselves, as it inevitably led to retaliatory raids that hurt innocent people on both sides. "These horse thieves," Jake asked, "what did they look like?" Key described 3 men, one with a red beard and a scar across his left cheek, riding horses with a distinctive brand. Jake felt his blood run cold as he recognized the description: the Dawson Gang, a group of cutthroats who'd been terrorizing the territory for months. They'd stolen cattle from his neighbor Tom Bradley just last month. "You did a brave thing, trying to get your people's horses back," Jake told the boy. "But sometimes the brave thing and the smart thing aren't the same." Key nodded solemnly. "My grandfather, he say same thing. Say young warriors must learn when to fight and when to think." As they talked, Jake found himself impressed by the boy's maturity and wisdom. Despite his youth, Key spoke with the thoughtfulness of someone much older, and his gratitude for Jake's kindness was expressed not in words but in small actions: gathering dry wood for a potential fire, watching for signs of danger, sharing the dried meat he carried in a small pouch. Belle nickered softly, and both Jake and Key looked up to see her ears pricked forward, her attention focused on something in the distance. Jake shaded his eyes with his hand, scanning the horizon for whatever had caught the horse's attention. "What is it, girl?" he murmured, but Belle just stood still, listening to something beyond human hearing. Key suddenly sat up straighter, his head tilted in a listening pose that reminded Jake of a wild animal sensing danger. The boy's expression changed from curiosity to excitement, and he jumped to his feet despite his weakness. Horses, Key whispered urgently. Many horses. Coming fast. The sound reached Jake's ears a moment later, the distant thunder of approaching hoofbeats, growing steadily louder as they echoed off the canyon walls. In the shimmering heat of the desert, it was impossible to tell how many riders were coming or their intentions, but the urgency in their pace suggested this wasn't a casual journey. Key scrambled up onto the rocks for a better view, his young eyes sharper than Jake's weather-beaten ones. After a moment, the boy let out a cry of joy and began waving his arms frantically over his head, shouting in Apache. "My people," he called down to Jake. "My father comes." Jake felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. While he was genuinely happy that the boy would be reunited with his family, he also knew that Apache warriors who found their missing child with a white man might not stop to ask questions before taking action. Relations between the Apache and settlers in this region were tense at the best of times, and these weren't the best of times. He checked his rifle and revolver, not with any intention of starting a fight, but because a man who couldn't defend himself in Apache country was a fool. Then he stood beside Key, making sure he was clearly visible as a friend rather than a threat. The riders crested a low ridge about a quarter-mile away, and Jake could see them clearly now, a dozen Apache warriors on painted ponies, their weapons glinting in the harsh sunlight. They rode with the fluid grace of men born to the saddle, covering ground with a speed that seemed to defy the laws of physics. Leading them was a man who could only be Key's father. Even at a distance, Jake could see the family resemblance in the way they both sat their horses, and the obvious relief and joy on the warrior's face as he spotted his son. But Jake also noticed how the other warriors spread out in a practiced flanking maneuver, surrounding the rocky outcrop where he and Key waited. "Key," Jake said quietly, "you need to tell your father that I'm a friend. Make sure he understands I helped you." The boy nodded vigorously. "I tell him. You saved my life, Jake. My father will know this." The warriors reached the base of the rocks and dismounted with fluid efficiency, their movements coordinated like those of a hunting pack. Key's father approached first, his dark eyes taking in every detail of the scene. His son, obviously weak, but alive. The white man standing protectively nearby. The nearly empty canteen lying in the shade of the makeshift shelter. Key began speaking rapidly in Apache, his words tumbling over each other in his excitement to tell his story. Jake watched the father's face carefully, seeing surprise, gratitude, and something else. A deep, measuring look that seemed to weigh Jake's soul. When Key finished his tale, silence fell over the group like a blanket. The father stepped forward, his hand extended in a gesture of peace. "I am Naiche," he said in careful English. "This boy is my son. You give him water when you have little. Why you do this?" Jake met Naiche's steady gaze without flinching, recognizing the weight of the moment. How he answered this question would determine not just his immediate safety, but possibly the relationship between these Apache and the white settlers in the region. "Because he needed it more than I did," Jake said simply, "and because it was the right thing to do." Naiche studied him for a long moment, then turned to examine the nearly empty canteen. He picked it up, hefted its weight, and looked back at Jake with something like amazement in his dark eyes. "This all water you have?" Naiche asked. "Yes," Jake replied honestly. "It's enough to get me home, maybe, if I'm careful. But you give half to Apache boy. Strange, white man." Naiche shook his head slowly. "Most white men, they would ride past. Let Apache boy die in desert." One of the other warriors, a younger man with intricate war paint, spoke sharply in Apache. Jake caught the hostile tone even though he couldn't understand the words. Naiche responded firmly, his voice carrying the authority of a leader, and the younger warrior fell silent, though his expression remained skeptical. "My brother, he say white man trick us," Naiche explained. "He say you save boy to make Apache trust you, then you bring soldiers to our camp." The war chief's expression was neutral, but Jake could sense the test in his words. "Your brother's wrong," Jake said calmly. "I'm just a rancher trying to get home to my cattle. I don't have any soldiers, and I sure don't have any tricks. I saw a child who needed help, and I helped him. That's all." Key spoke up then, his young voice carrying a passion that surprised everyone. He gestured toward Jake, toward the canteen, toward the shelter that had protected them from the worst of the day's heat. Though Jake couldn't understand the Apache words, the boy's tone made his meaning clear. He was defending the man who had saved his life. When Key finished, Naiche nodded slowly. "My son, He say you very thirsty but still share water. He say you make shelter, keep him safe from Sunday. He say you ask for nothing. The war chief paused, then added, Key, he is smart boy. I trust his words. Jake felt some of the tension leave his shoulders, but he remained alert. Apache culture was complex, and he knew that gaining their respect was only the first step in getting out of this situation alive. Rancher, Naichi said suddenly. You say you have cattle. Where is your ranch? Jake pointed northwest, toward the distant valley where his land lay. About 2 days' ride that way. Little spread called the Broken Wheel, near Willow Creek. Though there ain't been much water in Willow Creek lately. Broken Wheel Ranch, Nietzsche repeated thoughtfully. You are Jake Brennan? The fact that the Apache war chief knew his name sent a chill down Jake's spine. Yes. How do you know that? Nietzsche smiled grimly. Apache know many things. We know Broken Wheel Ranch. We know Jake Brennan never steal Apache horses, never attack Apache people. We know you, honest man. Even when time's hard. The revelation that the Apache had been watching him, evaluating his character from afar, left Jake feeling exposed and uncertain. But Nietzsche's next words carried a tone of respect that was unmistakable. My people, we watch all white men in this territory, Nietzsche explained. Some are bad, they steal, they kill, they break promises. Some are different. You are different, Jake Brennan. You treat Apache fairly when we come to trade. You never cheat us. And now, he gestured toward Key, who was drinking more water from a full water skin one of the warriors had brought. Now you save my son's life. Jake felt a weight he hadn't realized he was carrying begin to lift from his shoulders. I just did what anyone decent would do. No, Nietzsche said firmly. Most white men would not risk their own life for Apache child. This we know from much sad experience. He looked around at his warriors, who nodded in agreement. But you different. The war chief walked over to where Bell stood patiently in the shade, examining the horse with the practiced eye of a man who knew good livestock when he saw it. Fine horse, he commented. Strong legs, good wind, but thin. All animals thin this year. Worst drought I've ever seen, Jake agreed. Lost half my herd already, the rest. He shrugged, not wanting to burden these men with his problems. Yes, drought is hard on everyone, Nietzsche said. Apache horses also suffer. Apache people also suffer. But Apache know this land, know where water still flows underground, where grass still grows in hidden places. As they talked, Jake noticed the other warriors had relaxed considerably. Several were tending to their horses, while others had begun preparing what looked like a small meal from supplies they carried. Key sat with them, looking stronger by the minute as he continued to drink water and eat dried meat and pemmican. Jake Brennan, Nietzsche said suddenly, his tone becoming formal. You save my son. Apache law say debt must be repaid. What you want for payment? Jake was about to say he wanted nothing, that helping the boy had been reward enough when he caught himself. He'd learned enough about Apache culture to know that refusing to allow them to repay a debt could be seen as insulting, as if their gratitude wasn't worth accepting. I don't need payment for doing what's right, Jake said carefully. But if you insist on some kind of repayment, maybe you could just remember that not all white men are your enemies. Nietzsche smiled at that, the first genuine smile Jake had seen from the war chief. This we will remember. But Apache debt is more than memory. You give my son his life. This is sacred debt, must be repaid with sacred gift. The war chief spoke rapidly to his men in Apache, and Jake noticed several of them nodding enthusiastically. Whatever Nietzsche was proposing seemed to meet with their approval. We cannot repay sacred debt today, Nietzsche continued. But soon, very soon, Apache will come to Broken Wheel Ranch. We will bring payment that honors the life you saved. 2 weeks later, Jake stood in the doorway of his small ranch house, watching the sunrise paint the eastern mountains in shades of gold and rose. The drought continued its relentless assault on the land, and 3 more of his cattle had died during the night. At this rate, he'd have nothing left to sell by the time the bank came calling. Belle stood in the small corral, her ribs showing despite the hay he'd managed to buy in Tucson. The well remained dry, and he'd been hauling water from a spring nearly 5 miles away when the spring was running. Lately, even that reliable source had been reduced to a trickle. Jake was contemplating his empty coffee cup and wondering if he had enough water to brew another pot when Belle suddenly lifted her head, her ears pricked forward with interest. In the distance, Jake could hear what sounded like thunder, but the sky was clear, The sound grew louder, more distinct, and Jake realized it was the drumming of many hoofbeats approaching fast. His first thought was cattle rustlers or horse thieves, and he reached for the rifle hanging beside the door. But as the riders crested the ridge overlooking his ranch, Jake's jaw dropped in amazement. It was an Apache procession unlike anything he'd ever seen. Naichi rode in the lead, his war bonnet marking him as a chief, followed by at least 30 warriors. But behind them came something that made Jake's heart race with disbelief: a herd of horses, magnificent animals with sleek coats and proud bearing, being driven by Apache herders. As if that weren't enough, Jake could see pack animals loaded with what appeared to be supplies, and women and children accompanying the group. This wasn't a war party, it was an entire community on the move. The procession approached his ranch with ceremonial dignity, and Jake stepped out to meet them, his rifle forgotten inside the house. Naiche dismounted and walked forward, his expression solemn but his eyes warm with what Jake was beginning to recognize as Apache humor. Jake Brennan, the war chief, announced in a voice that carried clearly across the morning air. Apache people come to pay sacred debt. Key appeared from among the riders. No longer the desperate, dying child Jake had found in the desert, but a healthy, bright-eyed boy who practically glowed with excitement. "Jake," he called out, sliding down from his horse and running forward. "We bring gifts." "Gifts?" Jake managed to croak, still trying to process what he was seeing. Naichi gestured toward the horse herd. 20 horses. Strong horses, good for ranch work, good for riding. Apache horses, the finest in all territory. Jake felt his knees go weak. 20 horses of that quality would be worth more than his entire ranch, certainly enough to pay off the bank and start rebuilding his herd. "I can't accept this," he said automatically. "It's too much." "Sacred debt cannot be too much," Naichi replied firmly. "My son's life worth more than 20 horses, worth more than 100 horses." But the war chief wasn't finished. He signaled to the pack animals, and several Apache women began unloading supplies: bags of corn, dried meat, blankets, and tools. "Food for hard times," Naichi explained. "Tools for ranch work, blankets for cold nights." As the morning progressed, Jake found himself overwhelmed not just by the generosity of the gifts, but by the Apache people themselves. The women set up a temporary camp near his house with efficient skill, while the men began examining his property with the eyes of experienced ranchers and farmers. An elderly Apache man approached Jake, his weathered face creased with lines that spoke of many years and much wisdom. Naiche introduced him as Geronimo's brother, a man whose knowledge of the land was legendary even among the Apache. "Your well," the old man said without preamble, pointing toward the dry hole Jake had spent so much money digging. "You dig in wrong place." Jake felt his heart sink. "Wrong place?" The elder nodded, then began walking across Jake's property with purposeful strides. He paused at several spots, knelt to examine the soil, and finally stopped near a cluster of mesquite trees about 100 yards from the house. "Here," he announced with confidence. "Water runs underground here, always water here, even in drought time." Several of the Apache warriors joined them, and Jake watched in amazement as they began discussing the best way to dig a new well. These men knew the desert better than any textbook, and their knowledge had been passed down through generations of survival in this harsh land. "But I don't have money for a new well," Jake admitted reluctantly. Naichi smiled. "Apache men strong. Apache men know how to dig. We dig well for you, part of sacred debt." As if to prove his point, several warriors were already gathering tools and marking out the area where the new well would go. Jake realized that the Apache weren't just giving him gifts, they were staying to help him use them. Throughout the day, Jake watched in wonder as his struggling ranch was transformed. The Apache women showed him how to preserve meat using traditional methods that didn't require salt, which was expensive and hard to come by. The men began breaking and training the horses they'd brought, demonstrating techniques Jake had never seen before. Key stayed close to Jake throughout the day, serving as an interpreter when language barriers arose, but also clearly enjoying his role as the bridge between the two cultures. "My father say you like son to him now," the boy explained as they watched the men working on the well. "He say, Broken Wheel Ranch is under Apache protection. No one hurt you, no one steal from you." The implications of that protection weren't lost on Jake. In a territory where cattle rustlers and horse thieves operated with impunity, having the protection of Naiche's band was like having the best security force in the West. As the sun began to set, the new well was already 8 feet deep, and the diggers were reporting that the soil was getting damper. The horses had been settled into Jake's corrals and pastures, their presence making the ranch look prosperous and alive for the first time in months. That evening, as the Apache families prepared their traditional meal and invited Jake to share it, he realized that something fundamental had changed in his life. He was no longer a struggling rancher facing bankruptcy. He was part of a community that valued honor, generosity, and mutual support above individual gain. 6 months later, Jake Brennan stood on the porch of his rebuilt ranch house, watching Key and several other Apache children playing with a litter of puppies near the new well that had never run dry, not even during the worst of the continuing drought. The Broken Wheel Ranch had become something he'd never imagined, a meeting place between two worlds, where Apache families came to trade and rest, and where white travelers learned that not all Indians were hostile. The bank payment had been made in full, with money left over to expand the operation. The 20 horses Nietzsche had given him had proven to be exceptional breeding stock, and Jake's reputation as a horse trainer was spreading throughout the territory. More importantly, the ranch had become a symbol of what was possible when people chose trust over fear. Jake's relationship with the Apache had deepened beyond mere alliance into something like family. Nietzsche visited regularly, often bringing news from across the territory and sharing the Apache perspective on territorial politics. Jake had learned enough of their language to conduct basic conversations, and his understanding of their culture had grown from ignorance to genuine respect. The transformation hadn't gone unnoticed by the territorial authorities. Jake had received visitors from as far away as Washington, government officials who wanted to understand how a white rancher had managed to establish peaceful relations with a people they considered hostile. His ranch had become an unofficial embassy, a place where disputes could be mediated and misunderstandings resolved before they escalated into violence. But perhaps the most significant change was in Jake himself. The man who had once worried only about his own survival now found himself responsible for something much larger, a bridge between cultures that could determine the future of the entire region. One afternoon, as Jake was working with a particularly spirited young stallion, a dust cloud on the horizon announced the arrival of visitors. But these weren't Apache. The riding style was distinctly military. A patrol of cavalry soldiers approached the ranch, led by a young lieutenant who looked nervous about being so close to known Apache territory. "Mr. Brennan?" the lieutenant called out as his patrol halted near the house. "Lieutenant Morrison, 3rd Cavalry. We've had reports of Apache activity in this area." Jake continued working with the horse as he replied, "Apache activity? You mean my neighbors visiting?" The lieutenant's expression showed confusion. "Neighbors, sir?" "That's right, Lieutenant. The Apache are my neighbors, and they're welcome on my land any time they choose to visit." Key appeared from inside the house, where he'd been helping Jake's new housekeeper, an Apache woman named Maria whose husband was one of Nietzsche's warriors. The boy had been staying at the ranch for several weeks, learning to read and write English while teaching Jake more of the Apache language. "Hello, soldiers," Key said politely in English, then added something in Apache that made Maria laugh from the doorway. Lieutenant Morrison stared at the scene in obvious bewilderment. "Sir, I don't understand. Are you saying you're harboring Apache in your home?" "I'm saying I'm hosting friends in my home," Jake replied firmly. "The same way I'd host any guest who came in peace." The lieutenant's hand moved toward his weapon, but before he could draw it, the unmistakable sound of rifles being cocked came from several directions around the ranch. Apache warriors materialized from positions they'd taken among the rocks and buildings, not threatening, but clearly ready to defend their friends if necessary. Nietzsche himself appeared from behind the barn, his expression calm, but his presence unmistakably that of a war chief protecting his people. "Soldiers," he said in careful English, "you are welcome at Broken Wheel Ranch if you come in peace, but if you come for war," he shrugged eloquently. Jake stepped between the two groups, his hands raised peacefully. "Lieutenant, these people are under my protection, just as I'm under theirs. There's no trouble here unless you make trouble." The standoff lasted for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Finally, Lieutenant Morrison holstered his weapon and signaled his men to do the same. "Mr. Brennan, I'll need to report this situation to my commanding officer." "You do that, Lieutenant, and you tell him that Jake Brennan vouches for every Apache on this ranch. Tell him that we've found a better way than fighting." As the cavalry patrol rode away, Jake realized that the greatest gift the Apache had given him wasn't the horses or the well or even the prosperity they'd brought to his ranch. It was the knowledge that kindness, once given freely, had a way of multiplying beyond anything he could have imagined. Years later, When historians wrote about the peaceful transition of the Arizona Territory from a war zone to a place where different peoples could coexist, they would point to several key moments and influential figures. But many would argue that it all began with a simple act of kindness, a thirsty cowboy sharing his last water with a dying child in the middle of the desert. Jake Brennan lived to be 78, never married, but was never alone. The Apache considered him family, and his ranch became a place where their children learned to read and write, where their sick came for healing, and where their elders shared stories under the stars. When he died, representatives from 40 different Apache bands came to his funeral, and they buried him with an Apache war lance beside his grave, the highest honor they could bestow on a warrior. The well the Apache had helped him dig still flows today, and the descendants of the horses Nietzsche gave him still run free on what is now the Brennan Apache Heritage Ranch, a living monument to the power of one good deed to change the course of history. On his tombstone, carved in both English and Apache, are the words Key chose to remember him by. He gave water to the thirsty, and the desert bloomed with friendship.